James Wilson couldn't remember the last time he'd slept properly. The nightmares from Vietnam still haunted him after all these years, and since Mary passed away 3 months ago, the empty space beside him made everything worse. He stared at his reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror of his small apartment. The face looking back at him had aged beyond its 68 years, deep lines carved around tired eyes, a week's worth of gray stubble and hair that needed a trim weeks ago. "Pull yourself together, soldier," he muttered, splashing cold water on his face. Today was important. His disability check had cleared, and he needed to withdraw cash to pay his landlord, who had made it clear he didn't accept late payments. The walk to First National Bank would take nearly 40 minutes, but the morning was cool, and his knees weren't bothering him too badly. James grabbed his worn leather wallet containing his ID and bank card, tucked it into the pocket of his faded army jacket, and headed out. The September morning carried a hint of fall, and James walked with the slightly uneven gait that had become part of him after shrapnel had torn through his right leg in '71. People hurried past, most avoiding eye contact with the elderly man in the old military jacket. He didn't mind. He'd gotten used to being invisible. When First National Bank came into view, James paused to catch his breath. The modern glass building gleamed in the morning sun, nothing like the humble brick bank it had been when he'd opened his account 32 years ago. Inside, everything had changed too. Sleek counters, digital displays, and young employees who didn't know his name anymore. As James pulled open the heavy glass door, the cool air conditioning hit his face. The bank was busy, with a line of about 15 people waiting for the 3 tellers. He took his place at the end of the line, leaning slightly on his good leg. Behind him, a tall man in an expensive suit entered the bank, nodding politely to James before getting in line. There was something familiar about him, but James couldn't place it. The man was huge, easily 6'7", with broad shoulders and the confident posture of an athlete. James noticed people doing double takes, a few whispering and pointing discreetly. The line moved slowly. After 10 minutes, James's leg began to ache, but he'd forgotten his cane today. He shifted his weight, grimacing slightly. The tall man behind him noticed. "You okay, sir?" he asked quietly. "Just an old war souvenir acting up," James replied with a tight smile. "I'll be fine." The tall man nodded respectfully. "Vietnam? 68th Combat Engineers, 69 to 72, James said, standing a little straighter. "My dad was Marines, 2 tours, the man said. "Thank you for your service," James nodded, appreciating the simple acknowledgement. Not many people bothered anymore. When James finally reached the front of the line, he approached teller window 3, where a young woman with a name tag reading Heather was finishing with another customer. "Next, please," she called, not looking up from her computer. James stepped forward, pulling out his wallet. "Good morning," he said, sliding his bank card across the counter. "I need to make a withdrawal, please." Heather glanced up, her professional smile faltering slightly as she took in James's appearance, his weathered face, worn clothes, and unkempt hair. Her eyes flicked to the security guard standing near the entrance. "Do you have ID, sir?" she asked, her voice cooler than it had been with the previous customer. "Of course," James said, pulling out his driver's license and sliding it across the counter. "I've been banking here for over 30 years. Heather examined his ID and typed something into her computer. She frowned, then excused herself. "One moment, please." James waited patiently as Heather walked over to a desk where a middle-aged man in a dark suit sat. They spoke quietly, glancing over at James several times. The manager, at least that's who James assumed he was, looked annoyed as he stood and approached the counter. "Sir, is there a problem?" James asked as the manager reached the window. "Mr. Wilson," the manager said, keeping his voice low. "I'm Richard Harmon, the branch manager. Could you step aside for a moment? We need to discuss something." James felt a knot forming in his stomach. "I just need to make a withdrawal." "Is something wrong with my account?" "Please step aside so we can help other customers," Harmon insisted, gesturing to the growing line behind James. James didn't move. "I've been waiting in line for 20 minutes. My leg is killing me. I just need to withdraw $400 to pay my rent." Harmon's expression hardened. "Sir, you're causing a disruption. There have been several incidents recently with individuals attempting to cash fraudulent checks or making withdrawals from compromised accounts. Your account has been flagged for unusual activity." "Unusual activity?" I get my disability deposit once a month and withdraw money for bills. Same as I've done for decades, James said, his voice rising slightly. Check my ID. Call the VA if you need to verify who I am. By now, other customers were watching. James could feel his face growing hot with embarrassment and anger. He hadn't felt this humiliated since returning home from the war to people who called him terrible names. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave, Harmon said firmly. We can discuss this when you return with additional identification and… He paused, looking James up and down. When you're more presentable. More presentable? James repeated, his voice quiet with disbelief. What does that mean? It means you're disturbing our customers and we have policies about appropriate conduct in the bank, Harmon replied, signaling to the security guard. If you'd like to discuss your account, you can make an appointment. The security guard, a burly man in his 30s, approached. Sir, I need you to exit the building now. James stood his ground. I've never been treated like this in all my years as a customer. I fought for this country while people like you were still in diapers, and this is how you treat a veteran? The security guard placed a hand on James's arm. Sir, please don't make this difficult. Take your hands off me, James said, pulling his arm away. I have a right to access my own money. Not if you're creating a disturbance, Harmon said. Kevin, please escort Mr. Wilson out. The guard took James by the elbow, firmly guiding him toward the exit. James tried to shake him off, but his bad leg betrayed him. He stumbled, nearly falling. Easy, old-timer, the guard said, his grip tightening. James felt his throat tighten with humiliation as other customers stared. Some looked away uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. No one except the tall man who had been behind him in line. Hold up, came a deep voice. What's going on here? The guard and Harmon both turned, their expressions changing instantly when they saw who was speaking. The tall man stepped forward, and now James could see people in the bank pulling out their phones, pointing them in their direction. Mr. Thompson, Harmon said, his tone suddenly respectful. I apologize for the disturbance. We're just handling a situation. Looks to me like you're throwing out an elderly veteran, the man called Thompson said, his voice calm but carrying throughout the now silent bank. And I'd like to know why. Sir, this is a private matter between the bank and a customer, Harmon said nervously. We have protocols when accounts show unusual activity. His unusual activity is making a withdrawal on the day his disability check arrives? Thompson asked, raising an eyebrow. I was standing right behind him. Heard the whole thing, Mr. Thompson. I assure you, it's Big Shaq to my fans, but my friends call me Michael, he said, stepping closer to James. And right now, I'm more interested in making sure this gentleman is treated with respect. James suddenly realized who the tall man was. Michael Big Shaq Thompson, the basketball star whose face was on billboards all over town. His youngest grandson had his poster on his bedroom wall. This isn't necessary, James said quietly to Michael. I don't want any trouble. No trouble at all, Michael replied, then turned to the manager. I came here today to open a business account, looking to deposit around $3 million from my new endorsement deal. But I'm thinking this might not be the right bank for me if this is how you treat your loyal customers. The color drained from Harmon's face. Mr. Thompson, there's been a misunderstanding. We take customer service very seriously, especially for our veterans. That's so, Michael said, looking pointedly at the security guard's hand still on James's arm. Doesn't look that way to me. The guard quickly removed his hand. James straightened his jacket, his dignity somewhat restored by the unexpected support. Here's what's going to happen, Michael said, addressing the manager directly. Mr. Wilson is going to complete his withdrawal without any more hassle. Then you and I are going to have a conversation about respect. He turned to James. If that's okay with you, sir? James nodded, too stunned to speak. For the first time in months, someone was seeing him, not as a burden, not as an inconvenience, but as a person worthy of respect. Absolutely, Mr. Thompson, Harmon said, forcing a smile. Heather, please assist Mr. Wilson immediately, and Mr. Wilson, please accept our sincere apologies for the misunderstanding. As James was led back to the counter by a now flustered Heather, he caught Michael's eye. The basketball star gave him a small nod and a wink. In that moment, standing a little straighter despite his aching leg, James felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, visible again, and not alone. James counted the crisp bills Heather handed him, carefully tucking them into his worn leather wallet. $400, not much to most people, but it meant he could keep a roof over his head for another month. The transaction complete, he turned to leave, finding Michael Big Shaq Thompson waiting nearby, his imposing figure causing other customers to steal glances and whisper excitedly. "Thank you," James said quietly as he approached the basketball star. "But you didn't have to do that." Michael shrugged his broad shoulders. "Seems to me I did. Nobody deserves to be treated that way, especially not someone who served." James nodded, unsure what else to say. The bank manager, Harmon, hovered anxiously nearby, clearly hoping to smooth things over with the celebrity. "Mr. Thompson, if you'd like to follow me to my office, I'd be happy to help you open that business account now," Harmon said, his professional smile firmly back in place. Michael looked at the manager, then back at James. "Actually, my schedule just filled up. I'll need to come back another day." He turned to James. "You had breakfast yet, sir? I was heading to grab some coffee before all this." Before James could answer, Michael was already guiding him toward the door, a gentle hand on his shoulder. James could feel the stares of everyone in the bank as they walked out. The famous basketball player and the disheveled veteran, an unlikely pair if there ever was one. Outside in the morning sunshine, James squinted and pulled his jacket closer despite the day warming up. Old habits from years of being cold in trenches died hard. "There's a good diner around the corner," Michael said. "Best pancakes in town if you're interested." James hesitated. "Listen, I appreciate what you did in there, but you don't have to babysit me. I'm sure you've got better things to do than have breakfast with an old man." Michael's expression grew serious. "Actually, I don't, and I'm not babysitting. I'm hungry and I hate eating alone." He grinned, his whole face lighting up. "Besides, my dad would kick my butt all the way to next Sunday if he found out I met a Vietnam vet and didn't bother to hear his stories." Something in the way he mentioned his father made James soften. "Your dad was in Vietnam too?" "Marines. 2 tours. Never talked much about it until I was grown." Michael nodded toward the street ahead. "Diner's just there. 10-minute walk." "Unless you'd rather I call a car?" "I can walk," James said, perhaps a bit too quickly. Pride was one of the few things he had left. "Lead the way." They walked side by side down the street, an odd pair that drew curious glances from passers-by. Michael slowed his normally long strides to match James's more measured pace. Neither spoke for a few minutes, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. "You said your dad was Marines," James finally said. "He make it back okay?" Michael nodded. "Physically, yeah. Took longer for his head to come home, though. You know what I mean?" James knew exactly what he meant. "What's your dad do now?" "Retired. School janitor for 30 years after he got out. Raised me and my sister on his own after Mom passed." Michael's voice carried a clear note of pride. "Never missed a day of work, never complained. Toughest man I've ever known." James nodded approvingly. "Sounds like a good man." "The best," Michael agreed. "And he'd be the first to tell me I was raised better than to stand by while someone who served this country gets treated like they don't matter." They reached Lou's Diner, a classic chrome and red vinyl establishment that had been serving breakfast for over 40 years. A bell jingled as Michael held the door open for James. The diner fell silent as people recognized the famous basketball player. The waitress who approached them, an older woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, recovered quickly. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," she said cheerfully, grabbing 2 menus. "Table for 2? "Hey, Dolores," Michael greeted her with familiarity. "That corner booth free?" "For you?" "Always." She led them to a booth away from the windows, offering some privacy from curious onlookers. "Coffee to start?" Both men nodded, and Dolores disappeared to get their drinks. "You come here often?" James asked, surprised by the staff's familiarity with the basketball star. "Since I was a kid," Michael explained, settling his large frame into the booth. "My dad used to bring me here on Sundays after church. Still do when he's feeling up to it." Dolores returned with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "Ready to order, or do you boys need a minute?" "I already know what I want," Michael said. "The usual. And whatever my friend here would like." James glanced at the menu, then at Michael. "You don't have to—" "My invite, my treat," Michael said firmly. "That's how it works." James relented, ordering eggs, bacon, and toast. When Dolores left with their orders, he wrapped his weathered hands around the warm coffee mug, savoring the heat. "So," Michael said, stirring cream into his coffee. "Vietnam. What outfit did you say you were with again?" 68th Combat Engineers, James replied, taking a sip of his coffee. "We built bridges during the day so other units could cross, then defended them at night. Not as glamorous as some jobs, but somebody had to do it." Nothing glamorous about any of it from what Dad told me, Michael said. Your dad talk about it much? James asked. Michael shook his head. Not until I was in my 20s. He had a rough time when I was little. Nightmares, jumping at loud noises, that sort of thing. PTSD. James nodded. We didn't have a name for it back then. They just called it shell shock or combat fatigue. Told us to suck it up. Did you? Have trouble, I mean? James stared into his coffee. Still do some days. More since Mary passed. Mary? My wife. Cancer took her 3 months ago. After 52 years together. James's voice wavered slightly. Still doesn't seem real some mornings. Michael's face softened with genuine sympathy. I'm sorry to hear that. 52 years. That's something special. She was something special, James said simply. Put up with me all those years after I came back. Different. Held me through the nightmares. Never complained when I couldn't hold down a job those first few years. Dolores arrived with their food, placing heaping plates in front of them. For a few minutes, they ate in companionable silence. You have family nearby? Michael eventually asked. Kids, grandkids? James nodded, his expression brightening slightly. 2 kids. Son's in the army, stationed in Germany. Daughter lives in Oregon with her family. Got 4 grandkids. He pulled out his wallet again, showing Michael a worn photo of smiling children. Haven't seen them since the funeral. They call when they can. They know about your situation? Michael asked carefully. James tucked the photo away. No need to worry them. They've got their own lives, their own problems. He took a bite of toast. What about you? Family besides your dad and sister? Not yet, Michael said with a smile. Been too busy with basketball. 10 years in the league now. My youngest grandson has your poster on his wall, James admitted. He'd never believe I'm having breakfast with you. Michael laughed. We should take a picture for him when we're done eating. As they continued their meal, James gradually relaxed. There was something genuine about Michael that put him at ease. No pity in his eyes, just respect. Can I ask you something? Michael said after a while. What happened with the bank? You said you've been banking there for 30 years. James sighed. Things change. People change. Used to know all the tellers by name. They knew me. Now it's all different faces, different rules. And I guess I don't look like their ideal customer anymore. Michael frowned. Because you're older? Because I'm older, don't dress fancy, and probably look a bit rough these days, James said matter-of-factly. After Mary got sick, taking care of myself fell to the bottom of the list. Haven't quite gotten back to it. Michael nodded thoughtfully, pushing his empty plate away. My dad went through something similar after Mom died. Stopped shaving, wore the same clothes for days. My sister and I had to practically drag him to the barber. It's not easy, James admitted. Some days getting out of bed feels like climbing a mountain. But you still do it. You still showed up at that bank today? Bills don't pay themselves, James shrugged. Landlord's been patient, but business is business. Michael leaned forward. Where are you living now? Small apartment on Pine Street. Nothing fancy, but it's close to the VA hospital. I can walk there for my appointments. The rent's due today? James nodded. Got to drop it off on my way home. Mr. Chen's a good landlord, doesn't charge as much as he could, but he needs the money on time. Michael seemed to be thinking something over. He took a long drink of his coffee before speaking again. James, I hope you won't take this the wrong way, but I'd like to help. Not charity, he added quickly, seeing James's expression harden. I have a business proposition for you. James raised an eyebrow skeptically. What kind of business proposition could you possibly have for someone like me? The kind that might make that bank manager regret how he treated you today, Michael said, a determined glint in his eye. The kind that could help a lot of other veterans, too. But I need someone who understands what they're going through, someone they'll trust. James studied the younger man's face, looking for any sign of pity or condescension. He found none, only sincere determination. I'm listening, he said finally. Michael smiled, pulling out his phone. Good, but first let's take that picture for your grandson. And then, we need to make a few calls. For the first time in months, James felt a spark of something he'd almost forgotten. Purpose. Whatever this famous young man had in mind, it felt good to be seen as valuable again, not just as an old man with problems. Dolores, Michael called to the waitress. We're gonna need more coffee. We've got plans to make. The next morning, James stood in front of his bathroom mirror, carefully dragging a razor down his cheek. The face looking back at him was one he hadn't seen in months. clean-shaven with his silver hair neatly combed. After breakfast with Michael yesterday, he'd stopped by the barber on his way home, using a small portion of his cash to get a proper haircut. "You still clean up pretty good, old man," he told his reflection, a ghost of a smile playing across his lips. On his bed lay clothes he hadn't worn since Mary's funeral, his one good pair of slacks, a button-up shirt she had given him for their last anniversary, and his navy blazer with his service pins attached to the lapel. Michael had insisted he wear them today. "We're not just going to talk to them," Michael had explained over their second cup of coffee yesterday. "We're going to show them exactly who they disrespected." The plan they'd worked out was straightforward enough. Michael had made several phone calls right there in the diner, first to his lawyer, then to a friend at the local news station, and finally to someone he referred to as the money man. James hadn't fully understood all the details, but Michael had assured him that by this afternoon, the bank would be singing a very different tune. James finished dressing, moving a bit slower than usual as he fastened each button. His fingers weren't as nimble as they once were, but there was a certain satisfaction in the familiar routine. When he was done, he stood taller, shoulders back, chin up, the military posture that had been drilled into him decades ago and had never quite left. A knock at his door came precisely at 9:30 a.m. Michael was punctual, just as he'd promised. James opened the door to find the basketball star dressed in an impeccable dark blue suit that had clearly been tailored for his towering frame. Beside him stood a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an even sharper pantsuit, carrying a leather briefcase. "Good morning, James," Michael said warmly, his eyes taking in the older man's transformation. "You look ready for battle." "Feel like I'm heading to one," James admitted, suddenly nervous about what they were about to do. "This is Diane," Michael introduced the woman. "Best lawyer in the state and a good friend. Her dad was Air Force, Vietnam era too." Diane extended her hand, her grip firm and confident as she shook James's hand. "It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Wilson." Michael filled me in on what happened yesterday. What they did was not just morally wrong but potentially illegal under several statutes protecting against age and status discrimination. James nodded, not entirely comfortable with all the fuss. "I appreciate you coming, but I don't want to make more trouble than it's worth." "It's worth plenty," Michael assured him, checking his watch. "Car's waiting downstairs. You ready?" James patted his pocket, making sure he had his wallet with his ID and bank card. "As I'll ever be." The car waiting for them was a sleek black SUV with tinted windows, the kind celebrities and politicians used. The driver, a man built like a linebacker, opened the door for them with a respectful nod to James when Michael introduced them. As they settled into the plush leather seats, James felt increasingly out of his element. "Nervous?" Michael asked, noticing James's expression. "A bit," James admitted. "Haven't been the center of attention in a long time. Not sure I like it much." Diane looked up from her phone. "You won't be alone, Mr. Wilson. We'll be right there with you. And remember, you have nothing to be ashamed of. You're standing up not just for yourself, but for others who might be treated the same way." The drive to First National Bank took less than 15 minutes. As they pulled up outside, James noticed a news van parked across the street, a reporter and cameraman standing nearby, apparently waiting. Michael saw them too and smiled. "Right on time," he murmured. "You called the news?" James asked, suddenly alarmed. "I didn't agree to be on television." "They're not here for interviews," Michael assured him. "They're just documenting. Trust me, the bank pays very close attention to its public image. Having a news crew nearby will ensure they take us seriously." As they exited the vehicle, the reporter recognized Michael immediately, nudging her cameraman who swung his camera in their direction. Michael gave them a small wave but didn't approach, keeping his focus on James and the bank entrance. "Ready?" he asked quietly. James took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and nodded. "Let's do this." The same security guard from yesterday was stationed near the door. His eyes widened when he saw James approach with Michael and Diane. He immediately reached for his radio, muttering something urgent into it as they entered the bank. Inside, the atmosphere changed instantly. Customers stopped what they were doing, employees froze mid-task, and all eyes turned to the unlikely trio. Richard Harmon, the branch manager who had thrown James out the day before, emerged from his office at a near run, his face a mixture of panic and forced professionalism. "Mr. Thompson," he greeted, pointedly ignoring James and Diane. What a pleasant surprise to see you again. I was just about to call you about that business account we discussed. I'm sure you were, Michael replied coolly, but that's not why we're here today. I believe you remember Mr. Wilson? Harmon's smile faltered as he finally acknowledged James. Yes, of course. Mr. Wilson, about yesterday there was a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? Diane cut in, stepping forward. I'd say it was considerably more than that. I'm Diane Reynolds, Mr. Wilson's attorney. We'd like to speak with whoever's in charge. Not just the branch manager, but the regional director or bank president. Harmon's face paled. I assure you that won't be necessary. I have full authority to resolve any concerns. It wasn't a request, Michael interrupted, his voice level but carrying throughout the now silent bank. Either you get your superior here within the hour, or we take our concerns, and that news crew outside, to your corporate headquarters. Harmon's eyes darted to the windows where the news van was clearly visible. I'll see who's available, he stammered, retreating to his office. Michael turned to James with a small smile. And now we wait. They were ushered to a conference room away from the main floor. A nervous young woman offered them coffee and water, which Diane accepted for all of them. James sat quietly, feeling oddly detached from the situation, as if he were watching it happen to someone else. You doing okay? Michael asked softly while Diane reviewed some documents on her tablet. James nodded. Just thinking about what Mary would say if she could see all this. She never liked a fuss, but she hated injustice even more. Sounds like a wise woman, Michael said. The wisest, James agreed. She's the one who taught me that sometimes you have to stand up, even when it's easier to walk away. The door opened and Harmon returned, accompanied by an older man with silver hair and a tailored gray suit that screamed authority. His face was stern, but his eyes were sharp and assessing as they moved from Michael to Diane and finally rested on James. Good morning, he said in a deep, measured voice. I'm William Preston, president of First National Bank. I understand there was an incident yesterday that requires my attention. Diane stood, extending her hand. Diane Reynolds, representing Mr. Wilson. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Preston. Preston shook her hand, then turned to James, offering his hand as well. Mr. Wilson, I apologize for keeping you waiting. The simple courtesy, being acknowledged as a person worthy of respect, wasn't lost on James. He shook Preston's hand firmly. Please, sit, Preston said, taking a seat at the head of the table. Mr. Harmon has given me his version of events, but I'd like to hear directly from you, Mr. Wilson. What happened yesterday? James glanced at Michael, who nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, James recounted the previous day's events. His arrival at the bank, the long wait in line, Heather's reaction to his appearance, Harmon's dismissal, and finally, being escorted out by security until Michael intervened. Preston listened without interruption, his expression giving away nothing. When James finished, Preston turned to Harmon. Is this accurate? Harmon squirmed in his seat. Sir, there were security concerns. The bank had received alerts about potential fraud. That's not what I asked. Preston cut him off sharply. Is Mr. Wilson's account accurate? After a moment's hesitation, Harmon nodded reluctantly. Generally, yes, but no buts, Preston said firmly. He turned back to James. Mr. Wilson, I want to personally apologize for the treatment you received. It was unacceptable and does not reflect the values or policies of First National Bank. With all due respect, Mr. Preston, Michael interjected, if it doesn't reflect your policies, then you might want to review them. Because from where I was standing, Mr. Harmon seemed pretty confident he was following procedure. Preston frowned. You raise a valid point, Mr. Thompson. Perhaps our policies need revisiting. He turned to Diane. I assume you're here because Mr. Wilson is considering legal action. That depends, Diane replied smoothly. My client was publicly humiliated, discriminated against based on his appearance and age, and denied access to his own funds. Those are serious matters. However, we're open to discussing appropriate remedies that acknowledge the harm done and ensure it doesn't happen again to Mr. Wilson or anyone else. Preston nodded thoughtfully. What did you have in mind? Michael leaned forward. Actually, I have a proposal. He outlined a program he called Veterans First, a specialized banking service for military veterans with Dedicated staff trained in veterans' unique financial needs, streamlined access to VA home loans, financial literacy workshops, and most importantly, a commitment to treating veterans with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance or financial status. As Michael spoke, James watched Preston's expression shift from defensive to intrigued. By the time Michael finished, Preston was actually nodding. An interesting concept, Preston admitted. It would require investment and training, but it could serve an underrepresented community. And frankly, it would be good PR for the bank. I'd be willing to be the public face of the program, Michael offered, but only on one condition. Preston raised an eyebrow. Which is? James Wilson gets hired as a consultant, Michael said firmly. Nobody knows better what veterans need from their bank than someone who's lived it. James's head snapped up in surprise. This hadn't been part of the plan they'd discussed. Preston studied James thoughtfully. You have banking experience, Mr. Wilson? 30 years as a customer, James replied honestly. But I worked in logistics in the Army, and I ran the office at a construction company for 15 years after that. I know how systems work, and I know what veterans like me face when we walk through doors like yours. Preston seemed to consider this, then nodded slowly. It has merit. We'd need to work out the details, of course. Compensation, hours, responsibilities. I think you'll find Mr. Wilson's insights invaluable, Diane said, and it would be a concrete demonstration of First National's commitment to making amends and improving service for all customers. James sat quietly, still processing what was happening. Yesterday, he'd been thrown out of this bank like he was nothing. Today, they were discussing hiring him. The world could change awfully fast sometimes. There's one more thing, Michael added, his eyes fixed on Harmon, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. Training for everyone from the security guards to the tellers to the managers, about respect, about veterans issues, about not judging people by their appearance. Preston followed Michael's gaze to Harmon, who looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. That seems entirely appropriate, Preston agreed. In fact, Mr. Harmon could lead the first session after he completes his own sensitivity training. Harmon's head shot up. Sir? Consider it a learning opportunity, Richard, Preston said crisply. Now shall we discuss next steps? As the others began talking about implementation timelines and legal agreements, James sat back in his chair, a strange feeling washing over him. For the first time since Mary died, he felt like he had a purpose. Again, something to look forward to, something to contribute, all because a famous young man had seen him when others looked away. You okay with all this? Michael asked quietly, leaning close while Diane and Preston discussed details. James nodded slowly, a genuine smile spreading across his face. Mary would have liked you, he said simply. For Michael Thompson, one of the most famous athletes in the country, that seemed to be the highest compliment he could receive. His answering smile was bright enough to light up the room. 6 weeks had passed since that morning in the bank's conference room. James straightened his tie in the mirror of his new apartment's bathroom, a far cry from the cracked mirror in his old place. The apartment itself was nothing extravagant, but it was clean, spacious, and most importantly, located in a building owned by one of Michael's business partners who offered reasonable rent to veterans. Never thought I'd be wearing a tie again at my age, James muttered to himself, making one final adjustment. His phone buzzed on the counter, a text from Michael. Cars outside. Big day today. James smiled. Michael texted him almost daily, now checking in, sharing ideas for the Veterans First program, or just sending funny videos. It was like having another son, one who was actually around. The Veterans First program was set to launch officially today, with a ribbon-cutting ceremony at the bank's main branch downtown. Local news would be covering it, and according to Michael, even some national outlets had shown interest. James had spent the past 6 weeks helping develop the program, drawing on his own experiences and those of the dozens of veterans he'd interviewed at Michael's suggestion. The process had been overwhelming at times. James had gone from barely leaving his apartment except for necessities to working regular hours at the bank's corporate office, meeting with executives, and speaking to groups of veterans about their financial needs. But with each passing day, he found himself standing taller, thinking clearer, and sleeping better than he had in months. Grabbing his jacket and a folder containing his speech notes, James headed downstairs. The black SUV that had become a familiar sight was waiting, with the same driver, Paul, holding the door open. "Morning, Mr. Wilson," Paul greeted him with a respectful nod. "Ready for the big day?" "As I'll ever be," James replied, settling into the back seat. To his surprise, Michael wasn't inside. "Where's the big guy?" "Meeting us there," Paul explained, pulling away from the curb. "He had an early TV interview about the program." James nodded, opening his folder to review his notes one more time. Public speaking had never been his strong suit, but Michael had insisted that James, not him, should be the one to explain the core of the Veterans First program. "They need to hear it from someone who's lived it," he'd said. When they arrived at the bank, a small crowd had already gathered outside. A podium with microphones was set up near the entrance, with chairs arranged in rows facing it. Bank employees, in their uniforms, stood to one side, including Harmon, who looked distinctly uncomfortable. James spotted Michael immediately, hard to miss given his height, talking to a group that included William Preston and several people James recognized from the VA. Michael caught sight of him and waved him over, a broad smile lighting up his face. "There he is," Michael called out, putting an arm around James's shoulders as he approached. "The man who made this all happen." James shook his head. "Pretty sure that was you, kid." "Teamwork," Michael corrected, then turned to the others. "Everyone, this is James Wilson, the heart and soul of Veterans First." Hands were shaken, pleasantries exchanged. James was introduced to people whose names and titles blurred together: the director of the regional VA office, the head of a veteran housing initiative, a state senator who served in Iraq. It was surreal, being treated like someone who mattered after so many months of feeling invisible. "5 minutes until we start," a young woman with a clipboard announced, ushering them toward the seating area. Michael and James took their places in the front row while Preston approached the podium. Camera flashes popped as photographers captured the scene. James spotted a familiar face in the crowd, Dolores from the diner smiling proudly at him. Preston welcomed everyone and began speaking about the bank's commitment to community service, smoothly transitioning into an introduction of the Veterans First program. He spoke about specialized services, dedicated staff training, and the bank's pledge to make financial services more accessible to those who had served. "But this program isn't my brainchild," Preston admitted. "It came from someone who saw a need and decided to address it. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to introduce Michael Big Shaq Thompson." The crowd applauded enthusiastically as Michael stood and approached the podium, his tall frame towering over Preston. Cameras clicked frantically. A sports superstar always made good news copy. "Thank you, Mr. Preston," Michael began. "But I can't take credit for this program either. The real story begins 6 weeks ago, right here at this bank." Michael recounted the day he'd witnessed James being escorted out, how it had reminded him of stories his own father had told about returning from Vietnam. He spoke about their breakfast at Lou's Diner, the ideas they'd shared, and how quickly Preston and the bank had embraced the concept once properly presented. "Today isn't about me," Michael concluded. "It's not even about righting a wrong, although that's how it started. It's about making sure that no veteran ever feels unwelcome or unimportant in this community again. So I'd like to invite the real visionary behind Veterans First to tell you more, Mr. James Wilson." The applause as James stood was polite but reserved. He wasn't a celebrity after all. Just an old man in a suit that still felt a bit too formal. His hands trembled slightly as he made his way to the podium, his prepared notes clutched tightly. Michael gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze as they passed each other. James placed his notes on the podium, looked out at the sea of faces, and suddenly felt his throat go dry. He'd rehearsed this speech a dozen times in his apartment, but now, with all those eyes on him, the words seemed to evaporate. He glanced down at his notes, then back at the crowd, their expectant faces waiting. In the front row, Michael nodded encouragingly. Beside him sat an older man with a weathered face much like James's own, Michael's father, who had flown in specially for the event. The elder Thompson gave James a subtle thumbs up. Taking a deep breath, James folded his notes and slipped them into his pocket. He didn't need them. 6 weeks ago, I walked into this bank to withdraw money to pay my rent, he began, his voice quiet but steady. I'd been banking here for over 30 years, but no one knew my name anymore. No one saw a customer or a homeowner or a veteran. They just saw an old man who didn't look like he belonged. The crowd grew very still. That's not unusual for veterans my age, James continued. We get used to being invisible. We came home from an unpopular war to a country that wanted to forget we existed. Many of us learned to keep our heads down, not make waves. But that doesn't mean we don't matter. From the corner of his eye, James saw Harmon shift uncomfortably. Good. When I was thrown out of this bank, I wasn't surprised. Disappointed, yes, but not surprised. What did surprise me was that someone noticed. Someone stood up. James gestured toward Michael, not because he wanted attention or credit, but because it was the right thing to do. His father raised him right. Michael's father nodded, a look of quiet pride on his face. Veterans First isn't just about making banking easier, though that's important. It's about seeing people who've gotten used to being invisible. It's about respect. James looked directly at Harmon now. And yes, it's about second chances too. James spoke for another few minutes, explaining specific features of the program, the dedicated service representatives, the simplified loan processes for VA benefits, the financial literacy workshops. He didn't need his notes after all. He'd helped design every aspect of the program over the past 6 weeks. I never expected to have a job again at my age, James concluded. Never expected to feel useful again. But here I am, and I promise you, every veteran who walks through those doors from now on will be seen, will be heard, will be respected, because that's what we all deserve. The applause that followed was no longer polite, it was enthusiastic, genuine. As James stepped away from the podium, Michael was the first to embrace him, followed by Preston, who looked genuinely moved. Excellent speech, Preston said, straight from the heart. The ceremonial ribbon cutting followed, with James and Michael holding the oversized scissors together, while cameras flashed. As planned, the first official customer of the Veterans First program was waiting, Michael's father, who stepped forward with a check to open a new account. What wasn't planned was the line that had formed behind him. Nearly 24 veterans of various ages, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes, all waiting for their turn. Word had spread through veteran networks, and they had come to see if this program was real or just another empty promise. One by one, they were escorted inside to the newly designated Veterans First Service area, where specially trained representatives, including a humbled Richard Harmon, were waiting to assist them. James found himself shaking hands, hearing snippets of war stories from different eras, and receiving grateful nods from men and women who recognized something of their own struggles in his speech. As the crowd thinned and the news crews packed up their equipment, James found a quiet moment to sit on a bench near the bank entrance. He was tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that came from doing something worthwhile. Michael joined him, loosening his tie as he sat down. "You were amazing up there," he said. Dad was impressed too. "Good man, your father," James replied. "You can tell a lot about a man by how he talks about his dad. The day we met, the way you spoke about him, I knew you were solid." Michael smiled. "He wants you to come to dinner tonight. Says you two probably have stories to swap." "I'd like that," James said. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the last of the attendees drifted away. "Did you ever imagine, 6 weeks ago, that getting thrown out of a bank would lead to all this?" Michael asked. James shook his head. "Never in a million years. I was just trying to pay my rent, keep my head above water. Now look." He gestured to the Veterans First banner hanging over the bank entrance. "Sometimes life takes strange turns." "The best kind," Michael agreed. James's phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his daughter in Oregon. "Just saw you on the news. So proud of you, Dad. The kids are telling everyone their grandpa is famous." James smiled, showing the message to Michael. "See what you started?" Michael laughed. "I just helped open a door. You walked through it on your own." As they stood to leave, James caught sight of his reflection in the bank's glass doors, shoulders straight, head high, a sense of purpose in his eyes that had been missing for too long. Sometimes, he thought, it takes being seen by one person to remember how to see yourself. 6 months later, On a crisp winter morning, James stood at the window of his office at First National Bank, watching snowflakes drift lazily from a pearl gray sky. His office wasn't large or fancy, but it had a door with his name on it. James Wilson, Veteran Services Coordinator. And that still gave him a small thrill every time he saw it. The Veterans First program had exceeded everyone's expectations. What had begun as one branch's initiative had spread to all 15 locations across the state, with banks in neighboring states reaching out to implement similar programs. In 6 months, they'd helped over 300 veterans secure housing loans, establish savings plans, or simply navigate the often confusing world of personal finance. A knock at his door pulled James from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, turning from the window. The door opened to reveal Richard Harmon, the bank manager who had once thrown James out. 6 months had changed Harmon, too. His formerly rigid demeanor had softened, and he now wore his Veterans First pin prominently on his lapel. "The Jefferson High students are here," Harmon said. 20 of them, just like Principal Walker promised. James nodded. The school outreach program had been his idea, bringing high school seniors to learn about banking basics, but also to hear veterans' stories and understand the challenges they faced. Today was the third such visit, and James found he enjoyed these sessions more than any other part of his job. "I'll be right there," James said, grabbing his folder of materials. "They in the community room?" Harmon nodded. "All set up. Coffee and donuts, too." He hesitated in the doorway. Mr. Thompson called. "Said he might stop by if his schedule allows," James smiled. Despite his busy life, Michael still made time to check in on the program regularly. "That would be nice, but those kids will have to settle for just me if he can't make it." "They're getting the better deal," Harmon said with unexpected sincerity. Then quickly added, "Don't tell him I said that," before heading back to the lobby. James chuckled as he gathered his things. The relationship between him and Harmon had evolved from antagonistic to respectful to something approaching friendship. Harmon had been required to complete 40 hours of community service at the local VA hospital as part of his sensitivity training, but he'd continued volunteering there long after his hours were completed. The community room was buzzing with teenage energy when James arrived. 20 students in various states of attention sat at tables arranged in a semicircle. Some looked bored, others curious, a few were already eyeing the donuts at the back table. "Good morning," James greeted them, setting his materials on the podium. "I'm James Wilson, and I want to thank you for coming to First National Bank today." A few mumbled responses came back. Tough crowd, James thought. Teenagers were a different challenge than bankers or veterans. "Before we talk about banking, I'd like to know who in this room has a family member who served in the military," James said. About half the hands went up. "Keep your hand up if you've talked with them about their service." Most hands went down, leaving only 3 raised. "That's pretty common," James said. "Many veterans don't talk much about their experiences. Some because the memories are painful, others because they don't think anyone wants to hear, and some because they don't think what they did was special." He leaned against the podium, abandoning the formal stance he'd planned. "I didn't talk about Vietnam for almost 20 years after I came home." A girl in the front row raised her hand. "Why not?" "Good question," James said. "When I came home in '72, the country was divided about the war. Many people were against it. Some treated returning soldiers poorly because of it. So many of us learned to keep our service quiet." "That's messed up," a boy near the back called out. "My brother's in Afghanistan. People better not treat him like that." James nodded. "Times have changed, thankfully. But what hasn't changed is that many veterans still feel invisible when they come home. They go from having a clear purpose, a team they can trust with their lives, to civilian life. Jobs, bills, responsibilities, but often without the support system they had in the service." As he spoke, James noticed the students growing more attentive. Even the ones who had been checking their phones were now listening. "So what does this have to do with banking?" James continued. "Well, 6 months ago I was kicked out of this very bank." He told them the story, not the dramatic version that had made the news, but the honest one, including how low he had felt after Mary's death, how he'd neglected himself, how one moment of being seen by Michael had changed everything. "The point isn't that I was mistreated," James explained. "The point is that one person choosing to see me as a human being, not as a problem, changed not just my life, but now the lives of hundreds of veterans. The community room door opened quietly, and Michael slipped in, staying at the back so as not to disrupt. A few students noticed him, eyes widening in recognition, nudging their neighbors, but most remained focused on James. Today you'll learn about bank accounts, credit scores, loans, all important stuff, James continued. But the most important thing you'll ever learn about money isn't math. It's that behind every transaction, there's a human story. When you understand that, you understand everything. Over the next hour, James and Harmon, with occasional input from Michael, once the initial excitement over his presence had settled, guided the students through basic financial concepts. They broke into small groups, each with a bank employee leading discussions about saving strategies, educational loans, and building credit responsibly. During a break, while the students descended on the donuts, Michael approached James. "You're a natural teacher," he said. "These kids are actually paying attention to a talk about banking." "That's practically a miracle," James laughed. "They're good kids. Just need someone to take them seriously." Michael nodded toward a quiet boy who stood apart from the others, looking at the veteran photos James had put on display along one wall. "That one reminds me of me at that age. Trying to figure out where he fits, why don't you talk to him?" James suggested. "Not about basketball, just talk." Michael considered this, then nodded and walked over to the boy. James couldn't hear their conversation, but he saw the teenager's expression shift from surprise to interest as Michael pointed to different photos, apparently sharing stories. After the students left, promises of field trip permission slips signed and thank you notes in progress, James, Michael, and Harmon sat in the now quiet community room with the remaining coffee. "That went well," Harmon said. "Principal Walker texted me that they want to make this a regular thing, maybe monthly." "Good," James replied. "The sooner they understand how money works, the better off they'll be." "It's not just about the money, though, is it?" Michael observed. "You're teaching them something else, too." James smiled. "Trying to. If even one of them looks at a veteran differently because of today, it's worth it." Harmon's phone buzzed. He checked it and stood up. "Mr. Preston is asking for the latest program numbers. I'll get those to him." He hesitated, then added, "Good session today, James, really good." After Harmon left, Michael stretched his long legs out in front of him. "You know, we never did open that business account I talked about that first day." James chuckled. "You were bluffing." "Not entirely," Michael said with a grin. "I did have an endorsement deal coming. Just wasn't planning to deposit it here specifically." He grew more serious. "But now I think I will. My foundation, too. The bank will appreciate that." "It's not for the bank," Michael said. "It's because I like knowing my money's where people are treated right. Where my dad can come in and not feel like he needs to wear a suit just to be respected." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. James glanced at his watch. "Don't you have practice today?" Michael nodded. "In an hour. But I wanted to tell you something first. The League's Community Impact Award, I've been nominated for it because of Veterans First." "That's wonderful," James said. "You deserve it." "I don't want it," Michael said simply. James looked at him in confusion. "What do you mean?" "It's a big honor." "It is, and if I win, I'm going to ask them to give it to you instead," Michael said. "This program exists because of you, James. Because you had the courage to stand up that day to tell your story, to do the work to make it happen." James shook his head. "That's not how I remember it. I remember being at my lowest point, and a famous young man seeing me when no one else did." "Maybe we're both right," Michael suggested. "Maybe that's the whole point. We all need someone to see us sometimes." The winter light through the windows was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the room. James thought about how much had changed in 6 short months, from a lonely widower barely keeping it together to a man with purpose, with work that mattered, with new friendships and renewed connections with his family. His daughter and grandkids were coming to visit next month, staying in the guest room of his new apartment. "I got a letter from a veteran in Oklahoma yesterday," James said. "His local bank started a program like ours. Said he opened his first bank account in 30 years. Hadn't trusted banks before." "That's what it's all about," Michael said. "Ripples," James nodded. "Mary used to say that you never know how far the ripples will go when you drop a stone in the water." "Smart woman," Michael said. "I wish I could have met her." "She would have seen through all your basketball fame right away," James said with a smile. "Would have had you carrying groceries for the neighbors within 5 minutes of meeting you." Michael laughed. Sounds like my mom. James stood up, gathering the materials from the student session. I should finish up some paperwork before heading home. You should get to practice. Don't want to make the coach mad. I'm the team captain. Coach is always mad at me anyway, Michael said. But he stood too. Dinner this weekend? Dad's making his famous ribs. Wouldn't miss it, James promised. As they walked out of the community room, they passed the wall of veteran photos. James had added a new one last week. Himself and 3 buddies from his unit standing beside the first bridge they'd built in Vietnam. Young men with serious eyes, arms around each other's shoulders, unaware of the long journey ahead. Michael paused, looking at the photo. Ever hear from any of them? 2 are gone now, James said quietly. Lost touch with the 3rd. Tommy Baker. Last I heard he was in Ohio somewhere. Michael pulled out his phone, tapping a note to himself. Baker, Ohio, I know some people there. Might be worth looking into. James felt a lump in his throat. Even now, Michael was still seeing beyond the surface and still thinking of ways to help. You're something else, you know that? Just paying it forward, Michael said. My dad always taught me that's how the world gets better. As they parted ways in the bank lobby, James watched Michael stop to sign an autograph for a young teller, taking time to ask her name and chat for a moment. The ripples kept spreading, James thought. From one moment of kindness in a bank line to hundreds of lives changed. Outside, the snow was falling more heavily now, but James didn't mind the walk to his car. His bad legs still ached sometimes, especially in the cold, but it was a small price to pay for where life had led him. As he stepped out into the winter afternoon, he straightened his shoulders and lifted his face to the sky, letting snowflakes land on his cheeks, feeling, even at his age, that the best was perhaps yet to come.